The child was staring at me again. I had noticed it 3 days into my posting on Kessm 4, and I still had not figured out what to do about it. Every morning, when I unlocked the equipment bay and started calibrating the day's batch of hearing implants, those enormous compound eyes would appear at the observation window, 6 feet off the ground, watching me, unblinking. The child was small for a Shen royal, barely reaching my shoulder, with a carapace the pale gold color of new bone, and antennae that trembled slightly whenever I switched on the tone generators. I had been told, during my orientation briefing, to avoid direct interaction with the 7th-born child of her radiance, Queen Velothar IV. The briefing officer had said it, in the same flat voice people use when they are trying very hard not to explain exactly how badly things could go wrong. I waved once, on the 4th morning. The child stared. I went back to work. My name is Callum Drake. I am 34 years old, and I am an audiological engineer, which means I spend my days doing something most people think is simple, and most doctors think is beneath them. I calibrate implants. I match frequencies to anatomy. I fix things that let people hear. I am extraordinarily good at it, and in 11 years of doing this job across 6 star systems, not a single patient has ever come back with a complaint. I had taken the Kessm 4 posting because the pay was good, and because my younger brother Owen had borrowed a considerable sum from people who did not believe in flexible repayment schedules. That is the entire story of how I ended up standing in an Imperial Shen medical station, breathing metallic recycled air, fitting hearing devices for border garrison soldiers, who clicked at me in irritation whenever I asked them to hold still. The Shen were not cruel to me. They were something slightly worse, indifferent. Humans had been in contact with the Dominion for 11 years. We had no military leverage they feared, no resource they needed urgently, no ancient alliance to call upon. We were a curiosity, a minor species from an unremarkable system who had shown up, been politely tolerated, and given access to secondary postings like this one, where nothing important happened, and no one important would notice us. I noticed the child's head tilt on a Tuesday. It was the kind of thing you only catch if you spend your life looking for it. The slight angle. The overcorrection. The way the child positioned themselves nearest to whoever was speaking, not for warmth or closeness, but for information, reading lips and vibration, and the movement of thorax muscles when a Shen forms certain consonants. The child was compensating. The child had been compensating for years, so smoothly that the people around them had stopped seeing it. I pulled up my portable diagnostic unit that evening in my quarters, not because I had any plan, but because I am the kind of person who cannot leave a puzzle alone. I ran what data I had. I cross-referenced with the Shen anatomical files I had been given clearance to access for my work with the garrison soldiers. And I found it. Velkta, a congenital malformation of the auditory organ cluster, present from birth, in a very specific subtype that the Shen medical literature listed as acceptable and managed. The child would never hear clearly. The Dominion's own physicians had looked at the case, noted it, and moved on. The child was royalty. They would adapt. They had adapted. What the Shen medical literature did not have, because it had been published before the relevant human research reached the Dominion's databases, was a case study from 30 years ago involving a species called the Thule. The Thule were biological cousins of the Shen, and 30 years ago, a human doctor named Petra Flynn had treated 4 Thule children with a variant of the same condition. The Shen approach had always failed because it targeted the primary organ cluster. Flynn had discovered, entirely by accident while running redundant tests that her supervisor told her were unnecessary, that there was a secondary resonance node sitting 2 millimeters below the standard treatment site. Miss that node, and the procedure accomplishes nothing. Hit it correctly, and the condition is fully correctable. I read the paper 4 times, then I started making a list of materials. I filed the preliminary note through official channels on a Wednesday. By Friday, it had disappeared somewhere in the 47 layers of Shen Imperial administration. I filed it again, more formally, with every supporting document attached. It disappeared faster. I understand bureaucracy. I have worked in 6-star systems. I know exactly how institutions protect themselves from information they are not ready to receive. I started building the device on my own time. My quarters on Kessm 4 were small, which suited me. I had a work table, a good light, and enough tools to do the job. The alloys I needed, I sourced from the station's spare parts inventory, logging them correctly under routine maintenance work, which they technically were. I ran my calibrations at night because the station was quieter and because I did not want anyone asking questions before I had answers worth giving. I failed 17 times. The first 3 failures were frequency mismatches. The next 4 were calibration drift in the secondary node targeting array, which I solved by rebuilding the targeting mechanism from scratch, using a design principle I borrowed from human cochlear implant work from the early 22nd century. The remaining 10 failures were increasingly minor, and I learned something from every one of them. I always play music when I work. Old stuff, recorded on Earth. Strings and low woodwinds. The kind of music that fills a room without demanding attention. I played it quietly from my bunk speaker while I worked at the table. I did not know, at the time, that the child had found a spot in the corridor outside my quarters, late in the evenings, and was pressing their auditory cluster against the wall where the vibration came through strongest. Dr. Ren found out about the device on the 14th day. Ren was my Shen supervisor, a methodical being with 4 decades of medical administration experience and a genuine talent for identifying problems before they became catastrophic. Ren was not cruel either. Ren was afraid, and when Ren called me into the office and laid out the situation in precise, unhurried Shen pidgin, I understood exactly why. This is the 7th-born child of her radiance. If you attempt a procedure and it fails, the consequences will not be bureaucratic. Do you understand what I am telling you? I told Ren I understood. I told Ren it would not fail. Not because I was trying to sound impressive, because I had run every simulation available to me across 17 iterations of failure and 1 final working model, and I had checked my results 4 separate ways, and I had been fitting hearing devices for 11 years without a single complaint. In that specific room, doing that specific thing, I was the best there was. I knew it the way you know your own hands. Ren was quiet for a long time. Then Ren said that I would need to go through official channels to get anywhere near that child. I said I knew. I said I had filed the paperwork twice already. Ren made a sound the translation implant in my jaw rendered as something between resignation and respect. Then Ren started making calls on my behalf, which cut the process from an estimated 9 months to 3 weeks. The palace medical official who finally agreed to hear my case was a senior Shen physician named Vreth, who had 4 decades of experience and an expression that communicated, across species lines, that he had already decided this was a waste of his time before I walked in. I did not try to impress him. I put the device on the table. I recalibrated it for human anatomy on the spot and fitted it to myself, talking through each step in my best Shen pidgin, showing the output data on my portable screen as I went. I handed him the full documentation, the Shen anatomical analysis, the Thule case study with Flynn's original notes, and my own 17 failure logs with annotations explaining what each one taught me and how the final design addressed every single point of failure. Vreth asked me 41 questions over 2 hours. I answered all 41 completely and correctly. When he ran out of questions, he sat back and looked at the device for a while. Approval came 3 days later. The fitting room was quiet the morning we brought Shivel in. That was the child's name, Shivel. I had not known it until the official paperwork came through, and saying it out loud for the first time felt significant in a way I did not have words for. Ren was there. Vreth was there. 2 palace attendants stood near the door with the particular stillness of people who are carrying enormous amounts of tension and have been trained not to show it. Shivel sat in the chair and looked at my hands. I explained every step in Shen Pidgin before I did it. Not because protocol required it, but because I always do that with young patients. It matters that they know what is coming. It matters that nothing is a surprise. I have worked with children across 5 species, and the universal truth is that fear makes everything harder, and clarity makes fear smaller. The child was very still. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of attention. Shivel watched my hands the entire time, with those compound eyes that caught the light and split it into 100 tiny pieces, and I thought, not for the first time, that the Shen were genuinely beautiful creatures, in a way that took humans a while to see. The device seated correctly on the first attempt. The calibration locked within 4 seconds. I ran the standard diagnostic sequence. confirmed resonance at the secondary node, and checked the output display twice. Then I activated it. SciVel went very still in a different way, a way I recognized. I had seen it 412 times across 6 star systems in patients of 5 different species, and I had never once gotten tired of it. The moment the world changed. The moment sound arrived where it had not been before. The child's head turned, slowly, toward the window. Outside, wind was moving across the landing platforms, making a low, uneven sound that I had stopped noticing weeks ago. SciVel's antennae rose. The mandibles parted slightly. I watched a Shen royal child hear wind for what was, I was almost certain, the first time in their life. We stayed quiet for a long time. Nobody in that room said a word. Vreth had his diagnostic recorder running, and he had stopped looking at it. Then SciVel turned and looked directly at me. "You make noise when you breathe," the child said, in clear Shen, in a voice that sounded slightly surprised. I said, "Yes. Humans do that. Sorry." SciVel said, "Don't stop." I did not tell anyone about that part afterward. It felt like it belonged to that room. I expected nothing after that. Genuinely. I filed my post-procedure report, noted the successful activation, recommended a follow-up calibration check at 7 days, and went back to the garrison soldiers who still clicked at me in irritation and still needed to hold still. 4 days passed. I recalibrated 11 implants. I ate my meals in the small human-designated canteen area and read old engineering journals on my tablet. I sent Owen a message saying the work was going well, without explaining what the work had been. The summons came on a Thursday. 2 palace staff arrived at the equipment bay at mid-morning and stood in the doorway with an air of absolute patience that somehow communicated that I had approximately no choice in the matter. I washed my hands, put down the calibration tool I was holding, and went with them. It took 40 minutes to walk to the audience hall. I spent most of that time becoming increasingly aware of exactly how many layers of the Shen imperial architecture I was moving through, each one larger and more elaborate than the last, each one quietly communicating that the being at the end of this corridor had existed for 800 years and had the governing decisions of 200 star systems filed in active memory. Her radiance, Queen Velothar IV, was larger than the briefings had prepared me for. Not physically, though she was tall, it was something else. The quality of presence that 8 centuries of absolute authority gives a person. Her carapace was dark, almost black, inlaid with pale engravings that I only later learned were the recorded names of every being who had altered the course of the Dominion's history. She looked at me for a very long time without speaking. I stood still and breathed quietly. I was not going to pretend I was not afraid, because I was. But I had been afraid before, and I knew from experience that the fear does not actually stop you from doing anything. It just runs alongside you like an unwanted companion. The Queen said, in perfect, completely unaccented standard English, "I have watched the recording of the fitting 3 times. I said I was glad the procedure had been successful. She said, "I spoke with my child this morning, as I do every morning. For the first time in SciVel's life, my child heard my voice." I did not say anything to that. There was nothing to say. The Queen asked me what I required. I told her I did not require anything. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when a being who has ruled 200 star systems for 800 years encounters an answer they were not expecting. Somewhere behind me, a senior palace advisor made a sound that my translation implant rendered as profound bureaucratic distress. The Queen said, "You repaired what my own empire's medicine declared irreparable, and you require nothing." I said I had done my job. The job was the thing I was good at. It would have felt strange not to do it. The Queen said, "Humans are very strange." I said, "We heard that a lot." She was quiet again. She turned to her court, and a conversation began in formal High Shen that moved too quickly for my pigeon to follow completely. I caught fragments, words I recognized, and one phrase that I looked up later, in 3 separate dictionaries to make sure I had understood it correctly. Vethkala. The translations varied slightly, but agreed on the core meaning. One who has altered the bloodline's story. It was not an honorary title. It was not a ceremonial gesture. In Shen culture, it was a declaration of permanent inclusion in the royal line's recorded history. granted only to those whose actions had changed the trajectory of the Queen's family in a way that could not be undone. It had been granted, in 800 years, to 31 beings. All of them had been Shen. The Queen looked back at me and said that from this day, my name would be inscribed in the Dominion's living record, that I was Vethkala to the royal line, that this was permanent and would follow my family name across generations. Ren, standing near the back of the room, made a sound I had not heard from a Shen before. I did not ask what it meant. Some things you understand without translation. I stood there for a moment and thought about the 17 failed prototypes sitting in a container under my work table. I thought about Owen and the particular way he always got into trouble, and the way I always ended up fixing it, not because I was obligated to, but because I could not help it. I thought about a small child pressing their auditory cluster against a wall in a corridor at night, feeling music move through stone because it was the closest they had ever gotten to hearing it. I said, "I'm going to need bigger quarters." Ren made the sound again. I was fairly certain by then that it was laughter. I have been asked about this story many times since. People hear the title, Vethkala, human of the royal line, and they assume there was a plan. They assume this was strategy. They ask whether humanity sent me deliberately, whether this was some long-game diplomatic maneuver, whether we understood all along that the fastest path into an ancient empire was not military power or trade leverage, but a single act of repair, aimed at a child who could not hear. The honest answer is no. The honest answer is that I noticed a tilt of the head and could not leave it alone. Humans have this quality. I have thought about it a great deal since Kessm 4th, and I believe it is the truest thing about us, more than our adaptability, or our stubbornness, or our very complicated relationship with rules we find inconvenient. We cannot walk past suffering we know how to fix. It is not a decision we make. It is not training. It is something older than that, wired into the base of us, at a level that precedes language and culture and strategy. A child cannot hear, and we know how to change that, and every single thing in us that makes us human says we do not keep walking. The Shen Empire had existed for 8 centuries. It had brilliant physicians and ancient medical traditions and resources beyond anything humanity had yet built. It had ruled over hundreds of species and cataloged thousands of medical conditions and produced treatments that extended Shen lives by centuries. And it had looked at one small child, and at one condition it had decided was acceptable, and it had moved on. I think about that sometimes. I think about what it says about power, and what it says about the way institutions eventually stop looking at the small things, because the small things do not affect the balance of anything large. And then I think about Petra Flynn, a doctor nobody had ever heard of, running redundant tests that her supervisor told her were unnecessary, finding a secondary resonance node 2 millimeters below where everyone else had been looking, 30 years before I ever needed that information. She did not discover it for strategy. She discovered it because she was the kind of person who runs one more test when the first result does not sit right with her. That is the thing about us. We collect small discoveries and file them in databases and attach them to case studies and send them out into the galaxy, and then 30 years later, someone who has never met us pulls the file and finds the piece they were missing. There are now 4 human audiological engineers posted to Shen medical stations across the Dominion. The Shen invited them. The application was filed 3 weeks after the ceremony where my name went into the living record. I did not plan that either. I want to be very clear about that. I just fixed what I knew how to fix. I am still on Kessm 4. My quarters are larger now, which is genuinely appreciated. Shivel comes to the equipment bay sometimes and watches me work, the same way as before, except that now when I play music, the child stands very still and listens rather than pressing against the wall. Last week Shivel asked me to explain what the low instrument in the recording was called. I said it was a cello. The child said the word twice, carefully, getting the sounds right, then stood and listened until the piece ended. I went back to calibrating the implant in my hands. The small work, the right work, the thing I crossed 6 star systems and breathed metallic air for 2 years to do. The galaxy keeps calling us strange. I think they mean it as an observation. I am beginning to think it might be a compliment,